Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the closing of the United Nations Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum 2021. These have been incredible 6 days. Over 3,700 people joined us via the forum platform, and an additional 3,000 watched via the YouTube stream from over 100 countries. The forum set out to track the progress of governments and businesses in implementing the UNGPs and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and assess enablers and barriers in promoting responsible business in Asia Pacific. While doing so, we hope to raise awareness, enhance commitment, and build the capacity of various stakeholders around responsible business and human rights issues and standards in the region. During the closing today, we would hear from the co-organizers the progress made so far, the challenges that remain, and the opportunities that are there for us to strengthen the business and human rights agenda in the next decade. And to begin with, I would like to invite Marit Niels, Economics Affairs Officer at the UN ESCAP. Marit, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harpreet. So just a few reflections on the sessions that were organized, that we were part of organizing in the session. There was a session around inclusive business, which showed that firms can have a large impact in providing affordable goods and services that enhance economic opportunities, including those at the base of the economic pyramid. And that governments need to play a pivotal role in supporting the emergence of more of these types of business models, which is also shown that some in Southeast Asia are already taking a role in providing guidelines and strategies in this regard. We also saw some sessions around sustainable supply chains that talked about the challenges of ensuring responsible business practices in the lower tiers of supply chains. It was a very rich discussion, which noted some of the remarks or some of the reflections from that were that, as we all know, leverage decreases with the distance, and the lower tiers are normally where most of these issues are found. The discussion noted the importance of having a risk-based approach when performing responsible business-related due diligence and addressing risks and adverse impacts where it is the most severe and not where it's the easiest. We talked about the importance of constructive dialogue and a collaborative approach in solving issues, and I think this will come across in many of the reflections from this forum, of course. And of course, the big issue of cost sharing. You can't push the costs all the way down. It has to be shared across the different tiers in the supply chain if we're going to reach a sustainable and responsible way that it takes care of the needs of all the rights holders across the sphere. The session also discussed how it's important how contracts are done so that they're secure both ways and that the midstream doesn't get squeezed. And that traceability can be applied. It's an expensive process and a difficult one, but it can be applied perhaps where there is a high risk. For example, an example was given where one works with midstream suppliers and choke points and uses traceability at those points to collect information in an efficient way. And it was also noted that a lot is happening, for example, in Bangladesh, but the suppliers are not necessarily compensated for the improvements through higher payments of the goods. So these are some things to be addressed. And finally, we had jointly several organizations a session around climate change. And some quick reflections from that is that it's extremely urgent. It's about to change or be changed. And earlier, climate change was applied mainly with a risk lens, but now it's really becoming integrated throughout functions, and that strong goals and targets can really help drive progress and innovation in companies, but it really needs to be matched by action. And the extreme importance of involving youth, indigenous groups, and making the solutions holistic. And the issue of trust was also brought up, and the whole economic system, that we need to think about how the company obligations to society when it looks at profits versus social benefits, that the whole system will come into question in a sense. So at ESCAP, we're working on supporting inclusive business. We're working on responsible business practices, and we're currently working on a report on trade investment and climate change. We have a lot of different divisions working on energy, environment, social issues, trade and investment. So I won't be covering that, but the challenges are great, and the opportunities are great as we look forward. Climate change is providing a lot of pressure. Things will need to change. Things are coming together. Even the human rights and the climate change agenda, as we see in climate change litigation, for example, increasing in the region, which is putting pressure on companies and on governments. Actually, not only in the region, in the world, but also in this region. The finance sector is coming together and is adapting goals for net zero, for example, that is putting pressure on companies they invest in to act. So the pressure is increasing, and there's a great opportunity for action, and we need to keep the speed up, and actually rather increase speed a lot, to make sure that the next decade will be one that really sees strong action. It's promising, but it's challenging, and it needs to happen quickly. And I think I'll leave it at that. There will be many after with good recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Marit. And I would now like to invite Katja Fredwold, Program Manager, We Empower Asia, UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Katja, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Harpreet. Thank you very much, colleagues. And thank you, everyone who has participated in this important dialogue. I have to say, I really enjoyed the last couple of days. And I've just 3 reflections, much more generic than what my colleague Marit just shared. But I was reflecting on what we have been saying actually last year in the closing session. And the first thing, the first point is kind of building a little bit on this. I think one of the comments we have made last year, that we have been focusing very much on larger businesses, and we need to make sure that we diversify more and really reach down more and really involve much more small, medium-sized enterprises as well. And I think there were multiple sessions and multiple discussions and really good practices on how SMEs actually can contribute to this agenda. And particularly from a UN Women's perspective, obviously we were happy and really encouraged to see that there were so many women-owned enterprises also that were participating in the forum, but also participating in that so important agenda and sharing good practices and sharing or creating business models that actually really contribute to a much more inclusive business in general. This morning we had a session on unpaid care work, which really had a very interesting speaker or speakers that really emphasized on the importance of bringing new business models into that sector and really solving some of the most persistent challenges through more inclusive business models. We've seen the same in one of the first days or first sessions in the textile industry, really hearing amazing examples of young entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, who really kind of looking on how to include minorities, rural women into supply chains that are so often not looking so much deeper. So I think that's a really positive thing to see that there was much more focus on diverse businesses this year. The second area, and Merit elaborated on this already, is that I think I've seen a lot of discussion around transparency, accountability. I think that's something where we've seen way more tools, different stakeholders actually participating, like stock exchange commissions that we had in some of our panels. So really kind of a more diverse audience discussing accountability and transparency. I think there were a lot of tools, new frameworks, new researches shown. So I think there's also a call for probably more alignment there. But really something positive to take forward. And the third observation or the third principle I want to kind of elaborate on is a little bit, for UN Women, the Leave No One Behind principle is a very important one. It's core to our mandate. And I really felt that at least in the sessions that I participated or even kind of just sneaked in, there was quite a lot of focus to not only discuss about, but also with some of the most vulnerable groups. I think we have never seen so many sessions on the children. We have never seen so many, I think, migration-focused sessions or sessions around young people. So I think also there a much more diverse conversation took place. So for me, I think the facet of all of this more inclusive, more diverse, more knowledge, I think, has been shared than ever before. I think there's a lot that is out there, and I think it calls really for the topic of the forum, the next decade of action. I think asks for a decade of acceleration and putting all of this together and really not leave anyone behind. And as UN Women, I think we're going to commit further to particularly set the focus on women and girls, but really ensure that the rights of all genders are respected. So thank you very much for everyone in this discussion during the forum. Back to you, Harpreet.
Thanks, Katya. Some really important reflections. I think business model, transparency, accountability, this is something that we've heard across various sessions, and we hope to make progress on these particular issues in the coming years as well. I would now like to invite Freddie Kwaikon, Program Manager, Responsible Supply Chains in Asia Program, International Labour Organization. Freddie, yours.
Harpreet, thank you very much, and thank you very much to all the co-organizers of the forum, and to all the others, UN 70, as well as all the participants. I think during this phase of interesting discussions and conversations, there were many points raised to continue implementing actions to advance international labor standards as well as rights at work at the company level. I mean, from our perspective, there are 4 points that were particularly raised and discussed the participants. The first has to do with informal economy. The work with the informal economy is a point being raised in many regions and is a priority to improve working conditions of workers. And I mean, now it's highlighted the importance for permanent associations to provide support prices. That was raised has to do with gender equality and non-discrimination at the workplace. Yeah,
Freddie, we are unable to hear you clearly. Maybe if you can switch off your camera, it may be better. Freddie, can you still hear us? Okay, I think Freddie is joining us back again. And sorry for that disruption in between. But while Freddie is joining back, may I invite Carla Correa, Children's Rights and Business Specialist at the UNICEF East Asia and Pacific Regional Office, for her reflections. Carla, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harpreet, and good morning and afternoon, everyone. Well, in the last days, we discussed how business in Asia-Pacific are making significant strides in respecting the rights of children. With emerging evidence and benchmarks, we're building on a story in which business are establishing more sustainable practices and operationalizing human rights commitments. Still, significant impacts on the lives of children and their families remain unaddressed at the local level, and this was something that was highlighted in one of our sessions. Business play a crucial but often overlooked role with respect to some of the fundamental rights. Even when direct linkages are acknowledged, the private sector champions often focus narrowly on the exploitation of child labor, which is still a material issue across supply chains, but also on the lack of respect for younger workers' rights. However, the sessions also highlighted to us that business employ children's caregivers and produce and deliver many critical products and services for child development, sometimes together with governments, as in the case of education and healthcare. When it comes to the environment, and this we had a specific session on this, no group is more vulnerable to the environment harm than children. And harm to the environment that comes from business operations interferes with a host of child's rights, which includes the rights to life, health, development, food, housing, water, sanitation, play, and recreation. This role is often not reflected in decision-making within either the public and the private sectors. The sessions also highlighted to us that research is there and is presenting this year that the COVID-19 crisis is affecting business and ensuing increased vulnerabilities for children, young people, and their families in the region. Micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, which are the main source of income for most households and in countries across Asia-Pacific, are being the most affected. The economic impact on these businesses is exacerbating poverty and a series of child rights issues, including nutrition, education, child protection, and healthcare. More accountability on the part of business is needed in Asia Pacific, and this was clear in the discussions that we had with a different set of stakeholders. But business actions alone, especially in the case of the small and medium enterprises, cannot mitigate the far-reaching impacts of the economic crisis. Effective laws and legislations need to be in place, accompanied by political will, mechanisms to prevent rent-seeking behavior and political patronage, and the participation of the whole society, including children. Discussions indicated that the challenges of today tells us that the principle of doing no harm is not enough. Business are called to be proactive in protecting, but also fulfilling the rights of all children, with actions that are implemented through an inclusive and transparent process. As we reflect on the issues of today, let us take benefit of the next decade to be the one in which business go beyond awareness and commitments, but effectively implement available child rights and business guidance, learn from each other, and support public efforts and initiatives to protect children and their families. The region needs a major step forward in concrete efforts to prevent and address business-related child rights impacts, especially on the most vulnerable. The year of 2021 marks the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the UNGPs, and next year will mark the 10th anniversary of the Children's Rights and Business Principles. These are milestones that are opportunity for us to reflect on progress and challenges, but more importantly, to make a renewed push for proactive and collective action. So, UNICEF, we thank you for taking part of this year's forum's discussions. We hope that this dialogue continues, and we stand ready to support business action. We need business to help us transform the current economic crisis into an opportunity, and channel the power of transformation to create a better future for each and every child. Thank you. Over to you, Harpreet.
Thanks, Carla. And I see Freddie is back with us. Freddie,
Yes.
Can you still hear us? Okay, the floor is yours.
Yes, perfect. Okay, thank you very much, Harpreet and colleagues from the other 7 agencies co-organizing this forum, and also to the participants. As mentioned before, many important points were raised to continue implementing actions to advance international labor standards, as well as fundamental principles and rights at work at the company level. From our perspective, we identified 4 areas which were raised by many of the speakers and the panels during the last 5 days. I mean, the first point has to do with the informal economy. The work with companies in the informal economy was raised by many of the speakers, and this remains a priority to improve working conditions of workers in supply chains and particularly in the lower tiers. And it is important for governments and business associations to provide support to micro, small, and medium enterprises under the current circumstances, as well as in the recovery phase after the COVID-19. The second point is related to partnerships. This was an important point that came out during the different discussions, and is the need to have collaboration and partnerships among the different stakeholders who are committed to contribute to the implementation of socially responsible labor practices at the company level. Stakeholders cannot achieve it on their own. A third important point has to do with gender equality. So in terms of gender equality and non-discrimination at the workplace, lots is being done in the region, but this is not working, and inequalities are widening. Inequalities are widening due to COVID-19, and the recovery should ensure women, and in particularly younger women and those facing multiple forms of discrimination, are able to get back to the workforce by ensuring gender-responsive recovery that contributes to close existing gender gaps on all levels, including addressing gender-based discrimination and violence and harassment. Disproportionate paid and unpaid care duties and ensuring women's voice, representation, and leadership on all levels. Now more than ever, there is the need to ensure the right of everyone to a world of work free from violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment, by ratifying and implementing the Violence and Harassment Convention, the Convention 190 of the ILO, and it's a combined recommendation 206. The fourth and last point is related to child labor. Well, a wealth of experience was shared in the sessions related to child labor, which shows also the tremendous amount of work that has gone into the elimination of child labor by many different stakeholders over the last 2 decades and longer. Collaboration and partnerships are needed at the sectorial, national, regional, and global level. Some examples are the ASEAN Roadmap, but also the Alliance 8.7, in which we work together with UNICEF. The COVID-19 pandemic in particularly calls for a renewed effort to ensure the elimination of child labor stays on the agenda of governments, business, and other stakeholders. The International Year of the Elimination of Child Labor, which is this year, is a unique opportunity to keep the momentum going and to think out of the box and propose innovative actions. We also look forward to the launch of the new global estimates on child labor on the 10th of June, in time for the World Day Against Child Labor. We hope that you will remain engaged in the region and will continue contributing towards achieving the SDG number 8 on decent work. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Freddie. With that, I would like to move on and invite Olivia Sarendria, Global Business and Human Rights Lead at the United Nations Development Programme. Olivia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Harpreet. I tried to attend as many sessions as I could. Certainly, I went beyond those organized by UNDP, and I find them all very interesting. And what I heard mostly sounded like a strong validation of what I highlighted already in our report on the status of business and human rights in Asia, reflections and directions, as we titled this report that we launched. And I was looking for confirmations, which I found certainly in the various sessions I attended, but also I found interesting in some of these sessions went into unpacking the issues in greater details, and also they provided some additional nuances that perhaps our report had not captured. But let me give you some overall reflections, not specifically only on our sessions, perhaps structuring it around some progress, some challenges and opportunities, again, looking at the next decade, which was the theme of our forum. Now, when it comes to progress, the most obvious progress evidence by and somehow reaffirmed by the very forum is, and many others have talked about it, in my view, the very growth of the discourse in Asia. I already made repeated references in my session in other occasions to the forum, the first one organized in 2016. Some may remember it was titled Forum on CSR and Human Rights, something almost unthinkable now in terms of the language that is being used. In this forum, we have heard almost exclusively about business and human rights. We've heard about the UNGPs, of course, about responsible business, very little about CSR and philanthropy. So the new lingua franca, if we want to call it the way of responsible business in Asia, is now business and human rights. We've heard governments, companies, CSOs, all speaking consistently the same language. And that is not a small achievement for this first decade. It gives the idea that BR is somehow, as a discourse, is being normalized, at least among those who attended the forum, hopefully even broader than that. And of course, speaking the same language does not mean that all actors then will act upon what they say. That's another story, and I'll say something about this when I talk about the challenges. But it is a necessary, important milestone that I think should be acknowledged. Importantly, and this progress relates specifically to the event, 8 UN entities co-organizing a forum on business and human rights, 40 plus partners, is unprecedented. Again, others refer to it. I really want to thank all the co-organizers. The tent keeps growing, keeps getting larger and larger, as Dante would say. And I think we should all feel proud of it, because these joint works bring what Carla was referring to as a diversity of issues, brings in all the different elements, all the different lens. We know that a one UN approach should be a standard, but we also know that is not the standard case in some thematic areas. So I think this is really an important achievement, and one of the things that makes me feel also optimistic about the future. Let me signal one more progress, perhaps, before I go into challenges. I'll call it continuing growth of policy commitments from governments and companies. Again, commitment does not come with guarantee of implementation. That's the obvious caveat to make, but it does bring expectations and at least a certain level of accountability towards those who make this commitment. We decided this year not to have a NAP session, but NAPs were still very much part of the narrative in many sessions. And it is widely recognized that if we look at progress in Asia in the last first 10 years, one of the perhaps partial progress really has to do with the adoption of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. So I was happy to register some continued commitment commitment from some usual suspects among governments, but also some unusual ones. And if those who have looked at the program more in detail would have found that there were some governments that participated in session this year that were not in governments in previous forums. Of course, the picture that we got from the forum is one of a glass partially filled and partially empty, just not to use always the cliche of half full and half empty. Indeed, in fact, the views of people on how full or half empty this glass is do vary, and we've heard many different opinions, but I think nobody objects on the fact that there has been some progress, and also there is some to be done. So let me move to the challenges in that regards. Probably too many to list, but one expression that I heard over and over, and I think summarizes most of the concerns, a little bit of a fil rouge running through all the concerns, is power imbalances, or as I heard you refer to, and I think in the session organized by IOM, asymmetries of powers. I very much like this other way to put it. The power imbalances between governments and communities, between big companies and small ones, companies and employees. I've heard it indeed when it came to big tech and all of us as users. I heard it in the migrant worker sessions, again in the very last session now, obviously on CP-spec. So a fil rouge, a word that to me summarizes most of the challenges highlighted, is power imbalances. Message was very clear, I think, that we are all called to do more, to go to the root of the problem of the power imbalances, which is shrinking of civil space. Problem that goes obviously beyond our specific discourse on business and human rights. Not a new one, and not one that we have not discussed already in our forums. The question is, again, what can we as BHR actors do to tackle the issue? I'm very glad to start with that. For the first time this year, we had a session not only on human rights defenders, but specifically on shrinking civil space. And I want to thank warmly the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights for having organized it. So a shout out to my colleague Katia Kiritsi, who just moderated the session. Let me say that the UNDP's project on business and human rights specifically increased, I believe almost doubled the focus on work with civil society this year. And I look forward to announcing soon with you, Harpreet, the initiative that we titled Voices, specifically designed to give greater space to rights holders. So stand by for that. Another challenge, the last one, and then I'll move on opportunities. I want to reflect on, it seems almost to the progress that I hinted to earlier, is that though this forum was attended by thousands of people, that are a lot more, of course, of the hundreds 5 years ago, this is still the 0.00 many 0.1% of the people in Asia. We need to go obviously much further. I remember we talked about this also during the closing session of the South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights, where we spoke about language barriers as one of the obstacles to be removed to go further. And I'm glad we made this forum available in 11 languages this year. I'm really interested in seeing how this idea impacted or not. I'm sure it will require some fine-tuning, but I'm convinced that we need to keep investing in this. Of course, barriers are not only of language nature. There are other barriers that we have acknowledged in this forum, which are of political, of lack of interest nature. Some of the business economies in Asia were very little represented indeed, especially at the government level this year again. Let me wrap up on opportunity. I think the forum in itself remains a strong opportunity. It's an opportunity to sustain this discourse that I mentioned at the beginning and make it growing even stronger. An opportunity to come together once a year that I really think we should keep giving to all those interested in business and human rights in Asia Pacific. The numbers you mentioned, Harpreet, are of course very good to hear. We should keep giving this opportunity for people to connect around the business and human rights agenda. UNDP remains obviously committed to support this event, certainly next year, hopefully for the years to come. And I know we'll be able to count on the support from our development partners, our donors, Sweden and the EU, which I take the opportunity to thank, because without support, this could have not be done. And of course, I hope the interest will remain vivid among all the other co-organizers and partners this year. A second opportunity, and I'm done. I'll close here. A second opportunity for Asia that I think was evidenced in this forum is what I like to call intra-regional race to the top. I think we have not yet received the data on the attendance of each session, but judging from the interaction on social media. And what I've heard, the one on mandatory human rights due diligence is likely to have gathered very, very high participation last year. MHRDD was probably the most repeated mantra in the forum, together with power imbalances. So there you go. We have one big challenge and at the same time a big opportunity. So this smarter mix, let's call it, this stronger presence of MHRDD, the liability discourse, the risk of de-risking risk, if I can make that up, from EU companies, are narratives that we need to use more and more in our advocacy with governments and companies in Asia. We have heard that also from the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, referring to mandatory human rights due diligence 1 hour ago. So, like her, I hope Asia will follow in EU's footsteps in that regard. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Olivia. Again, really important reflections. And I would now like to invite Pepi Kiviniyemi Siddique, Senior Regional Migrant Protection and Assistant Specialist, International Organization for Migration. Pepi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Harpreet and colleagues. And also a huge thank you for all the moderators and presenters who I hope are still listening in on our recap and the kind of takeaways from the 4 days of events that we had. I'm really pleased to be able to continue to raise the significance of well-being of migrants in the business and human rights space through this platform. And starting off with the kind of big session that we had that really just looked at the next decade of business and migration, I think the key takeaway that we took from there is that migration and business supply chains cannot be separated in the next decade. And so it's really important to continue to address the rights of migrants in there. While business practices and preferences may change, globalized supply chains and individual drivers to seek life improvement and opportunities will continue to drive migration. And so following from there, it was also underscored that the Sustainable Development Goals cannot be really achieved without safe, orderly, and regular management of migration. So trying to eradicate those unsafe, irregular, human trafficking, anything that takes away the rights of the migrant. And also then taking into account the huge contributions that migrant workers make back in their countries of origin. In recent years, we have really seen some fairly good engagement, both from regulators and businesses in this space to address the most severe human rights challenges that migrant workers experience. So this is in particular through the modern slavery legislations, for example, from various jurisdictions, and also the business engagement in eradication of recruitment fees, which is one of the biggest issues still afflicting migrant workers. But it should not really end there. And so, of course, we see that in the coming decade, much more can be done to maximize the development impact of migration, and really also looking at how that supports the way that we address some of the key global challenges, whether that's climate change, aging societies, or technological transformation, because all of these things drive migration in one form or another. And really kind of looking a little bit closer at that technological transformation was our session on the future of migration in fashion, where we see that the transformation is likely to bring with it some fairly large disruption in the way that workers are engaged in the supply chains. And that will require concerted effort from all actors to ensure that migrant workers are protected as the sector recovers both from COVID and transitions into circular economy, automation, and digitization. So as fashion moves to the new business models and it won't require as much workforce anymore, it is also the responsibility of the businesses what happens to their workforce, and how can jobs be either redefined, or how can we ensure that we reach deeper into the supply chains and really understand what happens lower down and in the other tiers. We were also really excited this year to have a session on migrant domestic work. It was the first time in this forum, we believe, and it really raised the significance of domestic workers in the spheres of business and human rights. It was a good timing for this session, as it's also the 10th anniversary of the Domestic Workers Convention, protecting and promoting the fundamental principles and rights at work of domestic workers. We hope to see that the next decade of action recognizes domestic work really for how essential it is to sustain our societies. It guarantees the well-being of millions of families and directly supports a healthy labor force in the market from which all businesses benefit. Responsible business must ensure inclusion of migrant domestic workers in their own border businesses and human rights agenda through implementation and promotion of ethical recruitment practices, supporting skills development schemes, but above all, recognizing that domestic work as work is deserving of dignity and respect. The session on remediation really acknowledged that it is in remediation that we bring about meaningful change with regards to human rights, particularly of those of migrant workers. Remediation is the test of human rights commitment, and that's where we start actually measuring the outcomes of the due diligence work that's happening. And this was mentioned in some of the other sessions as well, that the way that we look at actually measuring the human rights commitments is sometimes still a little bit missing, and I think remediation is a good place to start looking for those outcomes and results. During the session, it was underscored that for effective mechanisms addressing exploitation, that it needs to start from a place of trust and respect. And that goes a little bit to the asymmetry that was mentioned earlier as well, between big business and employers. And both sides need to trust each other to be able to do effective remediation. Also, there have to be systems in place to ensure that migrants' voices are heard. And here there are still some fairly large structural impediments. For example, in some countries, migrants are still not allowed to organize. There's no collective bargaining for their voice. But we do see that in the next decade, businesses have a real opportunity to step forward and invest in some of these ethical remediation practices based on the needs and the rights of migrant workers, and ensuring that workers are represented and consulted, both in how these remediation processes are set up, but also how they're run. To end on a positive note and really looking towards the next decade, I think we would like to see the debate around migration and supply chains of business to move on from seeing migration more as a problem to be managed to a driver of development, that brings about exchanges of ideas that can be further harnessed by the private sector. It's good that we worry about ethical recruitment and forced labor, but the next decade should be also about the positive impact of migration in business. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Pepe. I would now like to invite Georgie Lloyd, Regional Coordinator, Environmental Law and Governance at the UN Environment Programme. Georgie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Harpreet. And I want to start with a huge thank you to all colleagues in the collaborating UN entities. Many of our sessions this year were organized collaboratively, and this has really enriched the discussions. I also want to mark the oceans of gratitude that we pay to our UNDP colleagues, Harpreet, Kevin, and the whole team who have worked so hard on this forum this year. Of course, thanks go to the forum's donors and all of our distinguished speakers who generously gave their time and have shared their expertise across the 4 days. This year, UNEP co-hosted and organized 6 sessions, which explored the interlinkages between business, human rights, pollution, biodiversity, and climate change. Other sessions looked at broader environmental rights and the roles of those who advocate for the environment in contributing to a shift towards sustainable and responsible business conduct. The key takeaway, really, if we look at a higher level, is that human rights obligations related to the environment, both substantive and procedural rights, must be upheld by businesses and integrated into business conduct, as this is necessary to ensure viability and future of such business, as well as the well-being of people and the planet. So, of course, this was said multiple times by a number of our speakers, that responsible conduct that is environmentally friendly and upholds human rights obligations is good for business. UNEP is increasingly advocating for the interlinkages between business practice and responsibility, human rights, and the environment. And this advocacy is essential in contributing to a fundamental shift that is necessary within the next decade to achieve the SDGs and address the triple planetary crises that we are facing of biodiversity loss, climate change, and pollution. And businesses are stepping up. They're stepping up their actions in recognition of this need for the fundamental shift. Indeed, to push for the decade of action. And we've heard many examples of businesses being at the forefront of action to address human rights and the environment. However, of course, more does need to be done. And we've also heard throughout our sessions from multiple speakers representing not only business, but also CSOs, national human rights institutions, media, youth, Indigenous peoples, and environmental defenders, that a good deal more can and should be implemented to uphold obligations of human rights and the environment. The private sector play an important role as duty bearers to uphold and respect environmental rights, especially for vulnerable groups. And many of my colleagues have already alluded to this, particularly, children, including in formal, informal, and transboundary business activities. So I wanted to maybe share just 4 key findings or thoughts, takeaways. The first was that we know that civic space in many countries in Asia is shrinking. Livio referenced the session that we just organized with UN Human Rights on safeguarding civic space. Repressive laws are spreading with increased restrictions on freedoms to express, participate, assemble, and associate. And human rights defenders working on environmental protection, protesting land grabs, calling out illegal and unsustainable business practices, and defending the rights, resources, and territories of Indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups appear to be more vulnerable to attacks. Businesses can be more outspoken in supporting the right for participation, information, and assembly. They can particularly act in solidarity when there are calls for responsible action against their industry. They can engage further with local communities to ensure that their rights are not infringed by business practice. And they can ensure that SLAP suits are either not filed or that they do not associate with companies that do file such suits. The second reflection and takeaway is that the climate and environmental crisis is a child rights crisis. Today, children and future generations will suffer far greater than we do today. And there is a growing recognition on the responsibility and accountability of business to act on children's rights to a healthy environment at all levels. Again, other speakers have referred to this, but the recent litigation, Human Rights Council resolutions, grassroots climate strikes, all of these things speak to this growing understanding. and businesses and other partners can build on the need to address the long-term consequences of today's actions. The third takeaway is that there have been throughout our discussions calls for business conduct to fundamentally shift to address the environmental crises. And these calls are coming from multiple angles. They're coming from shareholders, they're coming from consumers, from professional bodies, from courts, from civil society, and more. And we heard throughout our sessions that we have to bring ecological concerns back into the center of all decisions that are made, both business decisions, but also political decisions. Nature needs to be brought back into each and every decision-making process. However, for some businesses, there's a lack of literacy in human rights and the environment, and some limited knowledge on how to change from the status quo, where decisions are made perhaps on profit margins, devoid of links to environmental impact. So there remains a need for awareness raising and the sharing of practical tools for business. And just one thing to highlight, that collaboratively, UNEP together with UNICEF and UN Human Rights are developing normative and practical guidance around children's rights to a healthy environment. And this does target also implementation activities for businesses. And this is an opportunity to advance work in that area. My fourth and final takeaway is that there is hope. And this did come out quite a number of times in sessions. Several businesses and CSOs feel that we're at a tipping point, although with the caveat that this was not consistent across all country contexts. But businesses are frequently recognizing the need for them to lead the fight to address climate change and environmental degradation, particularly when perhaps there is not such a progressive political context. This shift towards strategic action by business is also becoming more systemic. There was also a push for partnerships to achieve collective action, which I think was a really positive thing and an opportunity for us all. So from UNEP, we continue to look forward to partnering and contributing to this action to scale up on the fundamental shifts that are needed in this decade of action. So thank you, Harpreet. Back to you.
Thanks, Georgie. In fact, it really has been it truly has been a great teamwork, and we've had the pleasure of working with all of you. So really, thank you for all your partnerships as well. Last but not the least, I would like to invite Professor Surya Deva, the Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Surya for his leadership, for his guidance, for the partnership over the years. This is Surya's last forum as a UN Working Group member. But Surya, this is truly to thank you for all your leadership and for pushing us to do better each year, and sort of really challenging us, and then also providing us guidance, to move forward. So really, thank you for all your partnerships, for all your leadership over the years, and we hope and look forward to working with you in your other roles. Surya, the floor is yours, and the last words as well.
Thank you very much, Harpreet. I hope you can hear me. At the outset, I would like to thank all the UN organizers and the teams that have worked really very hard for many weeks to make this forum a success. So my congratulations for all this hard work. Now, Harpreet, as you mentioned, this is my last forum, but my reflections today are not based on the last 10 years. I would say my reflections today are based on the last 20 years of my work in the business and human rights field. And I agree with almost everything what colleagues have said previously in terms of the progress we made, the challenges, the opportunities, and all that. But I would like to think again more ambitiously, and that is also in line with what you mentioned, Harpreet, in terms of vision and leadership, 5 points. And I hope I will be brief on that. My first point is that we need a new model of development. The business and human rights agenda is not going to make significant progress in future if the current economic model continues, because this model does not work for everyone in society. It is leaving behind a significant number of people. Let me give just one example. If we look at the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index, it does not consider human rights issues. And the governments are doing still what we call race to the bottom. Olivia talked about race to the top. I wish we have those races to the top in reality, but I see significant races to the bottom still. And one contributing trigger is things like the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. So I think we need to change this model of development, which focuses on the growth of some. My second point is, and I have been saying it for quite some time now, that we need to pay greater attention to the outcomes. I think we are getting obsessed with the processes. National Action Plan is a process. Human rights due diligence is a process. And don't get me wrong, these processes are absolutely vital. But at the end of the day, we also need to make an assessment about the outcomes. What have we achieved for the rights holders on the ground? Now, everyone is now obsessed with mandatory human rights due diligence. I started talking about that the voluntary approaches will not work many, many years back when no one was talking about it. And I can say now that mandatory human rights due diligence will again have serious limitations, even if it is enacted. So don't get obsessed too much. It is needed, yes, but don't get obsessed about it. It will not fix many things. We need much more than that. My third point is that we need to recover the state. We need to build the political will on the part of the states to respect human rights, to take human rights seriously on their own, protect human rights and fulfill human rights. Because the BHR agenda is part of the wider space on business and human rights. The authoritarian model of governance, which is reflected by the 4th June, we can see this in many parts of Asia Pacific. The civic space is under significant pressure and shrinking, as other colleagues have mentioned. So unless we change this dynamic, the BHR agenda cannot achieve much progress beyond a point. My fourth point is informal economy and SMEs and MSMEs. I think we need to pay greater attention to them. Whether the BHR agenda and the tools that we have developed so far are really conducive. Are they working for those actors on the ground? Or do we need certain different approaches based on the experiences in the global south? I think that is a question we should be considering. And my last point is corporate accountability. We see some interesting patches of hope on corporate accountability. But at the end of the day, the struggle continues. And what we see more often is corporate impunity for human rights abuses rather than accountability. So I think we need to pay, again, greater attention to that. So I think these are my 5 points. What we need to do differently, not just next 10 years, but next 20 years, I would say, and going forward. And let me just once again say that it has been a privilege to work with all of you. And I'm not going anywhere. I may finish my mandate with the working group next year, but I will be very much here in the BHR space, and I look forward to further collaborations in years to come. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Back to you, Harpreet.
Thanks, Surya, and thank you everyone for these reflections today. I think I would not even try to, sort of try and sum up all of these reflections, but thank you very much. I think what I can say is, listening to all of you and across all of these sessions, that important victories were won in the first decade of the UNGPs in Asia, but there still exist gaps and hurdles and the need for the BHR movement to adjust for the decade ahead. We hope to work with, involve, and engage with all the stakeholders, including civil society organizations, businesses, governments, local unions, journalists, legal aid networks, organizers, associations, and human rights defenders in both formal and informal economies. Thank you, everyone, for joining us over the 4 days, actually 6 days of the forum. We look forward to working with you and stay engaged. The recordings of the forum would be available next week onwards, so stay tuned and keep watching the space. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a good weekend.